Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April edition of the Lainer Learning and Lunch. I actually already ate lunch, so sequentially it's lunch and learning, but you can call it learning and lunch since learning metaphysically, philosophically takes precedence over lunch. And so we call it the learning and lunch. Today I want to talk about a couple of the deeper themes of Passover. Obviously, it's pretty topical because next week is Passover. And also because sometimes we turn Passover into a holiday for children, which is fine. Obviously, the end of the Seder, the songs at the end of the Seder, Chad Gadya, Ad Yerhu, Echad Miyodea, they're all designed to keep kids up. That's what we're told from the time that we're young. But also, obviously, a holiday that is so central to our tradition, to our people, has deeper themes than just keeping kids awake. So I want to talk about it as three different themes. And the first one is a theme that we don't always appreciate, I think, the complexity of, even though it is the most familiar theme of Passover. And that is the theme of freedom. Because let's take the first two steps, which most of us are aware of, and then maybe a third. The first is they were slaves, now they're free. That's pretty simple. That's self-explanatory. That has inspired generations and generations, as we know, throughout not only Jewish history, but Western history. A lot of the themes of liberation movements, of liberation theology, of the Black community in the South during the Civil War and after, a lot of them were taken from the Exodus story. There is, in fact, a very fine book on this, a short book, if you're interested, called Exodus and Revolution by Michael Walzer, the political theorist. And that's simple in theme, not in execution, but you were slaves, you left, you're no longer slaves. The second piece of this, which is a deeper one, is the Isaiah Berlin distinction, which also, by the way, exists in the rabbis, of freedom from and freedom to. That is, you're freed now from the yoke of the slaveholder, but what are you free to do? And it's clear from the regulations that God imposes on the Israelites that they're not free to do anything they want. This is the way the rabbis put it is you're freed from the slaves of slaves. That is, you're freed from human beings who are the slaves of the master, to be slaves yourselves to the master. The direct relationship to God is one of servitude. Slavery has such negative connotations, but servitude. And you're not the servant of a servant, you're the servant of the master. And so part of Passover is the idea that we are liberated in order to serve God, not liberated to anarchy or to chaos, but liberated to service. That's part two of the freedom train, so to speak, of Pesach. But there is a third that is really important in order to understand the underlying idea of the Passover holiday from the point of view of slavery and liberation. And here's the third idea. I am right now not free to play the violin. I'm free to learn how to play the violin, presumably, assuming that I have the skills to do it, but I'm not free to play the violin because I don't know how to do it. You can only be free to do that which you can do. So the deeper idea of Passover freedom is that the fulfillment of human potential can only be found in service of God. And therefore, it is a greater freedom to be a servant of God than it is to not be a servant at all. Now, that for us is counterintuitive because we think the greatest freedom is not to have to serve anyone. But that's not how the tradition sees it. The tradition understands that you fulfill your violin playing potential, so to speak, by being a servant of God, and therefore Passover not only frees you from external constraints, but gives you the internal training to be fully free. Because fully free does not mean I do whatever I want. That's not how the tradition understands the idea of freedom. Freedom is I am able now to fulfill the potential that I have as a human being, which is the greatest freedom, to fulfill your potential. And so the freedom of Passover works in three stages: liberation from external constraints, liberation to listen to and obey God, and finally the obeying of God, which is the ultimate freedom. And this requires a different idea of freedom from freedom in American law. That's why, in theory, what America wants to make you is a law-abiding citizen, but you can still be a jerk. You can still be mean to your neighbor. You can still be cruel to your family. You can be lots of things and still be a law-abiding American citizen, but you cannot be all those things and be a fully law-abiding Jew, because it regulates how you speak, regulates how you behave. And for Judaism, that actually enables you, directs you to be free. So in this sense, you can think of it, this is not a perfect analogy, but I know you'll go with me on this because you're generous in spirit. In this sense, it's almost like being an addict. And self-discipline, while it might seem like a constraint, frees you from the addiction that is dangerous. And here too, freedom in the Jewish perspective requires discipline, but all real freedom in the Jewish idea requires discipline. Being undisciplined is not being free, it's just being undisciplined. Following the law gives you freedom. And that's one of the reasons why the meal that celebrates freedom is called a Seder. It's called an order, because order, regularity, discipline, if the right kind of order, is what makes you free. So that's theme number one, in a slightly deeper take than we would normally, I think, have it on Passover. And that's the theme of freedom, okay? The second theme of Passover, which is a very important one, is the theme of transmission. But it's not just transmission of the tradition, which is generally how people conceive of it or speak about it, is you pass the tradition on from generation to generation. It's transmission of a particular idea. And the structure of the Seder is intended to transmit this idea generation to generation. And the transmission of the idea is that God liberates human beings based in part on a moral order. That is, all of the Torah, all of the stories of the Torah have behind them this notion of good and bad, or varieties or degrees of good and bad. And we have so imbibed this that we don't see that it was revolutionary. Because in pagan religion, it was how you treated the gods that mattered, right? Read Homer. If you're good to the gods and the gods like you, Everything's good. The idea that human beings' moral conduct towards one another is decisive. This is a new idea. And the Passover Seder reinforces it in lots of different ways. The fact that you have different kinds of sons suggests a moral order, right? There are good people, there are wicked people, there are people who don't know the difference yet and have to be taught the difference. There are people who can't, like the Tom, like the simple one, who can't actually go to the depths of philosophical reflection, but can be told how to behave. The fact that you open the door and pronounce an anathema, you pronounce an anathema upon those who have been cruel and murderous towards the Jewish people. Even the last stories about, like, Chad Gadya is basically a morality tale. This one did good, this one did bad, this one did good, this one did bad, on and on and on and on. All of it is intended to reinforce this idea that there is a moral calculus in the universe. And the reason that this is so important, of course, is that to anybody who looks at the world, it is obvious that the moral calculus isn't working. And to most Jews, for most of history, as they celebrated Passover, they would have been entirely entitled to say the moral order isn't working. Because remember, Passover was sometimes, in certain societies at certain times, one of the worst times for Jews. It's when the desecration of the host and the baking blood of matzah for matzah and all of these various anti-Semitic canards were leveled against the Jews, and often Passover, Easter coincided and was a time of persecution for the Jewish people. And so the Passover Seder hammered home the idea that there is a moral order in the universe, even if that moral order is not immediately apparent to you, given everything that is happening around you at this time. And it harkens back to the original instantiation of the moral order, which is Pharaoh has been cruel to these people. I will liberate them and punish Pharaoh and his society beyond any kind of punishment that a society has seen before. And the fact that it happened on that scale reminds us also that our ancestors didn't suffer just individually, but they suffered collectively. And their dreams of revenge, and believe me, they had dreams of revenge, who suffers and is without dreams of revenge, were on a social scale, not just on an individual scale. And they hoped ultimately for, redemption that would put the Goyim in their place, who were at the time persecuting them. And we shouldn't hide or be ashamed of the fact that that was part of the emotional makeup of people who suffered at the hands of the surrounding society. Now, again, it's always important to remember, lots of variation over Jewish history. It was not one long chronicle of suffering, lots of variation, lots of different people, lots of different societies. But as a broad rule, this was the sense and the hope of a lot of Jewish society throughout, especially the Middle Ages and the early modern period, because they were persecuted, and Passover gave them this hope and sense that they would eventually be able to be liberated. So there are levels of freedom, and there is also the moral order. And then the third theme that I want to bring up is the theme of transmission, not of the moral order, but of the Jewish tradition. So there are basically two transmissive themes. One is transmit that there's an idea of a moral order, and the third is how do you transmit a tradition. Now, as we know, Passover is child-centered, but it's not just Passover that's child-centered. It's the Jewish tradition that is child-centered. The most famous prayer is the Shema, and what does the Shema begin with? And you shall teach this to your children, and speak of it when you go on your way, and when you lie down, when you rise up. In other words, it should be a constant accompaniment of your days and nights, because you are supposed to transmit this to the generations that come after you. And one of the most difficult and increasingly difficult problems that generations have is, how do you transmit specific religious content to those who come after you? And this idea bedeviled the Jewish tradition just as it did every other tradition. Is you have, one of the mysteries of being human is that you have memories, beliefs, ideas, and they cannot be transmitted by osmosis. Everybody, when they die, carries certain specific, untold, private memories with them that are lost to the world because they've never been expressed. And when a tradition realizes this, that you can't get children to understand what their parents understand just by virtue of being the children of their parents, the question becomes, how do you take those deep ideas and experiences and transmit them generation to generation? How do you do that? One way is through story. And this is going to be one of two primary ways. One way is through story. And so Passover becomes the tale of Passover, just as Purim becomes the tale of Purim, because the story that gets transmitted generation through generation through generation takes on its own sanctity and power. Families have family stories, and the Jewish people have a family story. And this story is about the liberation from Egypt. And you would think you wouldn't have to retell it at Passover, because after all, it's already in the Torah. But every telling of a tale, first of all, changes it a little bit, right? You can't tell the tale exactly the same way again and again and again and again. And so the rabbis froze their own telling of the tale, which is not identical, obviously, to the Bible. It adds a lot of different kinds of stuff. The rabbis froze their own telling of the tale so that the way they understood the story of the liberation of Passover would be the standard telling. And that's what you get in the Haggadah, which means the telling, of course, is not the story of the liberation from Egypt, but the rabbis' telling of the story of liberation from Egypt. And remember that they lived in Rome, which was another giant, impressive civilization like Egypt that, although not enslaving Jews quite the way Egypt did, in a different way, also oppressed and ultimately expelled the Jews. And so their telling of the story was a hearkening back to another time that Jews were the minority in a giant, impressive civilization that they had to rebel against. And now the analogy is with Rome. So the first way that you transmit this message is through telling. The second way that Judaism has hit upon, not just Judaism, but Judaism certainly has hit upon, to transmit the essential messages of the tradition is through ritual. And ritual, if we really think about it, ritual is a physical enactment of a kind of story. It's almost like an acting out of the story without necessarily literally acting out the story. So when you light Shabbos candles, for example, you are acting out the story of God ushering in peace after the 6 days of creation to the seventh day, in which now in the world there is light. And there's a story behind the lighting of Shabbat candles that makes Shabbat candles not just an act, but a ritual. And the same with the Passover Seder. The story behind the Seder we know. And all of the rituals of the Seder are tied in one way or another to part of the story, like the Seder plate. Why does the Seder plate have a shank bone? Well, because the sacrifice of the Pesach is part of the story. The Passover liberated us to our own land where we could build our temple and worship our God. And part of the way that you worshiped God, as we know, was with animal sacrifices. And the meal becomes a ritualization of the story. So you both tell the story and you do things that remind you of the story through ritual. And all of Jewish ritual, which includes verbalization, right? Ritual also includes what you say, like prayer. All of ritual is an act with a story behind it. That's part of what it means to be a people with a ritual. Now, okay, those are the three themes that I wanted to mention. I don't see on the Facebook page any questions, and I can't check the YouTube at the same time as I check Facebook. So I don't know if there are questions on the YouTube page. I don't see any that have been entered into the chat. So at the moment, I'm going to assume that there aren't any. But if that's true and there aren't any questions, then let me just wrap it up with a couple of concluding remarks about Passover, and that is that the reason, in part, that Passover is the central celebration of a lot of Jews is that it includes the beginning and the end of the story, right? It's the liberation from Egypt, which is the beginning of the peoplehood story, and opening the door for Elijah, which is the end of the story. And the transitional mechanism to get us there, which is the family. The family is even in the reading for the Passover, the family, it says, V'yeshiv lev avot al banim v'lev banim al avotam. That's what the prophet says will happen in Messianic times. The hearts of parents will be turned to children and children to parents. The family is the mechanism of redemption on a micro level as opposed to a macro level, not for the whole world, but for each individual. And so that's why Passover is sort of the quintessential family holiday more than any other, and one of the reasons why it's more beloved. It's a meal with family. So it has all of those elements. And the fact that it is the beginning of the story and the end of the story also helped Jews look ahead to the possibility of redemption in the future. And even the idea that the way you ate was different was inside of Judaism an instance of Judaism in the world, right? Jews in the world always ate differently from everybody else. And now even inside of Judaism, we're eating differently from the way we ate during the rest of the year. So it's almost a distillation of the Jewish way on Passover, a sort of concentration of it that makes it that much more powerful and that much more enduring. I hope that this has been helpful, has given you at least a little something to talk about at your Passover Seder. I wish you a Chag Sameach v'Kasher, a kosher and a happy and a joyous Passover. And God willing, Passover is one of 4 New Years in the Jewish calendar. May this new year bring us a year that is better than the couple of years that have preceded it, that is healthier, and may this spring bring a renewal to us and to the world. Take care, and